All right, it looks like we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mission Top. For those of you that are joining us for the first time or seeing this video later, it bears explaining what Mission Top is. In the simplest sense, Mission Top is a farmstead and a ranch, but it's more than that. Mission Top is a family, my family. My name is Gary Nuila, but Mission Top is also a place of ideas, a set of ideas. You could say a family trying to discern patterns of meaning out in the world and then trying to live it out in a concrete context. And then talk about it, see how it's going. You know, there's no efforts of here for some sort of perfection or purity or anything like that. It's more, we're much more focused on a process of progress than we are in some sort of final vision that we're trying to achieve. So that's what Mission Top is. And as you can see, this is a live stream. If whether you're here live for it right now or whether you're joining it with us later. And these live streams, there's a reason that I am doing these as a live stream. I don't want these to be the final state of these ideas and these presentations. These live streams are somewhat of a rough draft for hopefully more perfected, I guess you could say, presentations of these ideas. So if you are a person that is all about kind of the bells and the whistles, the images, the sounds, those kinds of things, these live streams may be a bit more difficult for you. If you're a person who is all about the ideas, well then these live streams may interest you a lot. So if you're the other type of person, nothing wrong with that, but maybe just keep on checking back on this channel as I try over time to take these ideas and then turn them into a tighter, more flashy package, I guess you could say. But this is the process of me trying to do that. These very much, again, a rough draft, and it very much helps me to have people to talk to about it. Even if it's just in this format with a text feedback from you in the chat, I really appreciate it. And just knowing that you're there, that there's humans on the end of this, it makes this a whole different experience for me. And more than anything, it kicks me in the pants to get on here and talk about ideas and get them done today. And every day, I am kind of rushing to collect my thoughts. That's why I was starting this stream just a little bit late, because it's always a race to actually get these into some sort of coherent package, even for this live stream. But you see, in the act of doing that, the ideas hopefully become better, and then I'm more ready to turn them into the next stage after this. So that is the nature of these live streams. But for some of you, being here kind of at the forefront of the ideas and the process of the ideas may be a lot more interesting than seeing them in their final state. So if that's for you, then you'll like these live streams over time. And I'm committed to doing these. I think we're about to the next 75 days or so, Monday through Friday. And after that, I'll most likely kind of take off the pace of these ideas and not do them Monday through Friday, but at least weekly, and maybe more than that. We'll see. So let's get into some preliminaries on the topic today. We are talking about the masculine and feminine today. And given that we live in the world that we do, we very much need to kind of lay some preliminaries so that people don't jump to conclusions and try to label me off as something and cancel me or whatever, those things that go on today. So when we're talking about the masculine and feminine in a context like today, we're talking about the masculine and feminine as categories, not as synonyms for men and women. And that's very important, kind of foundationally important. So one of the ideas that's kind of foundational to this is that everything, including you, has a masculine and a feminine nature as part of you. So everything that's talked about the masculine today has to do with you. Everything that talks about the feminine today has to do with you. But not just with you, but literally everything around you in reality. These seem to be foundational categories of how we, at least as humans, form the world around us in our consciousness, I think would be the right way to say it. And so the masculine and the feminine apply to everything, right? But the key thing is to not just think that when we talk about masculine and feminine, we're just talking about men and women. That being said, most men, I think, want masculinity foregrounded in their personhood, in their being, in their character, I guess you could say, and femininity backgrounded, and vice versa for women. I think most women would like femininity foregrounded in their being and masculinity backgrounded. And so it is the case that understanding masculinity and femininity as categories, symbolic categories as we're doing today, can help you understand men and women. But we can't take it too far to think they're just one-for-one things. Another way of looking at it is thinking of it in terms of kind of dimensions of a person. You know, how many dimensions are there to you that make you up? You know, probably thousands, right? And every dimension to you, whether it's kind of your an emotional dimension or a subset of your emotional dimension or your physical dimension or whatever, every dimension of you tends to lean masculine or feminine, right? And so as you better understand the masculine and the feminine, you'll see that there are parts of you that lean more masculine and parts of you that lean more feminine, right? And vice versa for other people, you know. And that's why certain people kind of fit together really well, you know, if you look at it that way. I always like to think of Rocky Balboa's quote when he's asked why he likes Adrian, right? And he's like, well, she fills my gaps. You know, everybody's got gaps. She's got gaps, I got gaps, we fill each other's gaps. And that's the right way, I think, to look at this, is that we all have these innumerable dimensions to our character, and most of them tend to lean one way, masculine or feminine, and that can help us to ultimately unify with other people. We find people that fill our gaps, whether it's a spouse, a loved one, or a business partner, or something like that. It's ways that we can complement each other, because as we see here at the end of the day, one of the biggest takeaways I want us to take away from understanding these categories better is that the masculine and the feminine are complementary, right? They are complementary opposites. And if we could just understand that in the world today, I think the world would be a lot more productive place, let's say, and not the place of turmoil that we often see it today. So that's one of the main takeaways that I want us to get to today, is that the masculine and the feminine are best seen not in conflict with each other. They can be, and we see that every day, but they can be in a coordinated balance with each other. The next thing that is important as a preliminary as we talk about this is that in symbolic categories, as we're talking about them today, there's not value judgments embedded in them of better or worse. So, and that's important because our culture has tended to kind of put value judgments on certain symbolic categories. So as an example, light and dark, right? We have this kind of innate value judgment embedded in it that light is good and dark is bad, right? But we need to kind of unlearn that tendency today. If you have a notion that, you know, something is good or bad, I'd like you to try to kind of check that and realize that when you see things with these symbolic categories, each one always has a way that it could go good or a way that it could go bad. So too much lightness, which is usually tied into masculinity, too much light can actually be a bad thing. And so it's not just that it's good. And darkness is the same thing. Darkness can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. So you can't just see these things as good or bad. The same goes with, there'll be categories that use purity language, pure and impure. Pure tends to be associated with masculinity, impure tends to be associated with femininity, and we'll see why, but you can't load a value judgment into those. And we do, and we bring in, notions of disgust as well. The pure is good, the impure is disgusting. There's a sense of ew to the impure. We've got to unlearn that if we want to understand these. And it's key to understanding these, I think, because the world used to be, especially in the past, just filled with these categories. And so if we bring in our value judgments into them, we're going to misread how these categories get used over time. So don't automatically read in a value judgment to these and realize that in their context, yes, they could be good or bad, but there can be an excess of masculinity and an excess of femininity, and a deficiency in masculinity, and deficiency in femininity. And you have to read these symbols and these categories in context. Okay. Another thing to realize is that everything ends up having a masculine or a feminine character to it, but that character can change over time. So here's an example: the countries of the United States and France. Right? Kind of traditionally over time, would you say which one is more masculine, which one is more feminine? And my kind of gut feeling, my initial reaction is that the United States is a more masculine country, France is more feminine, right? But if we just look at it, of course, the United States has masculine attributes and feminine attributes, and so does France, masculinity and femininity. And if you look at times in history, maybe these countries have more masculine or feminine moments, right? Like the United States right now, I'd say, is going through a feminine moment, because we'll see that feminine is associated with multiplicity, with fracturing and breakdown, right? And while masculinity is associated with a solidity in terms of identity. And if it's anything, the United States right now is going through an identity crisis, right? And so right now, the United States is going through more of a feminine moment. And you could look at a country like France, which I kind of, have always felt a little more feminine of a country. And of course, there's moments in that history where France has had more of a masculine character to it. So that's again, all these little hints to kind of just get you primed for what you're going to see in terms of the symbolic pairs as we get into them. All right, as I'm going to tell you up front the conclusions I want us to draw from this today, and we'll kind of wrap those up at the end, but I want to put them out now so that you can see how they apply to the whole presentation. So I already told you one of them, that what the world is missing today is seeing the complementary nature of the masculine and the feminine. And the other thing that I want us to see out of this is that, and improve in, is our ability to see that these categories just are embedded in narrative, in mythology, in religion, and everything around us, so that hopefully you leave here with kind of better goggles on, I guess you can say, to notice the masculine and feminine categories and how they're used all over the place. Because the more you start to see them, I think the more you begin to understand them over time. So an example is this thumbnail that I've got here right next to me. And I use this for a very specific purpose. Because when I look at this structure, which is Mont Saint-Michel in France, I immediately see masculine and feminine categories in it now. One of the masculine categories we'll get into is dry land, and feminine is flooded land or ocean. So you see that this very much is, it's dry land and ocean here, right? A masculine category is light and feminine dark. So you kind of see the light around the structure and the feminine around it. A masculine category is culture or work, and feminine is nature, right? So you see how the structure, again, shows the masculine and the world around nature. But also, I mean, here's what's kind of cool in just this image is that these categories are flexible depending on the context. So for example, the structure itself on this, the kind of temple, you could say, which is a monastery at the top of Mont Saint-Michel, which is considered a temple, that could be actually a feminine category. It's a body of sorts. And what does it house? It houses a spirit. You could say the spirit of God. So in that context, the structure becomes the feminine category, and the masculine is the more kind of unseen, but the pattern of God. And when you're there at Mont Saint-Michel, it's hard not to feel that the place has a spirit to it, right? And what's kind of cool is once you start seeing masculine and feminine categories like this, you'll look at a place like Mont Saint-Michel and you'll say, I wonder if that's why we're so obsessed with it. You know, millions of people come here every year and they consider it just breathtakingly beautiful. And so you ask yourself, why do they see it breathtakingly beautiful? Why don't they see that beauty in a Best Buy parking lot, an American box store that's here? Why don't they see that same beauty there? right? And I would posit, it's kind of one of my suggestions, that you look at a place like Mont Saint-Michel and you see beauty because you see these categories of meaning in them. And there are no more fundamental categories of meaning than the masculine and feminine. So if you look at Mont Saint-Michel, there's something in you that recognizes those categories of meaning and the way that they are unified there, right in front of you. And it is that feeling of meaning, of grasped meaning, that at least some part of you grasps, that gives you that sensation of beauty that you wouldn't quite get, looking at a concrete parking lot, right? So that's just a thought on that. Another introductory symbol that I've used before that really gets to the heart of how these categories interact is the Yin Yang symbol. And so I'll just briefly touch on that because I think it's very helpful. I might even leave it up as I go into the actual pairings themselves, because it will help you to kind of see how these things interact and how this symbol contains these the masculine-feminine duality. Right? So we've talked about this before. It's kind of best seen in terms of numbers. You can look at this and see one thing. There's just one thing there, and that's the totality of what's there. And that's kind of the world we'll get into. That's the world before you see these dichotomies, these pairings in them. It's all just one thing. But then as you look at it again, you see, oh, it's two things, right? It's the light part and the dark part. And the light part is, it represents the masculine, the dark part, the feminine. But it's actually three things, right? It's these two dichotomies, but it's the unity of them together. So it's, two of them plus seeing them together. And then maybe it's even four things, and that's seeing all those four things that I just talked about simultaneously. It is one thing altogether without categories, you could say. It's two individual categories kind of contrasted to each other. Then it's three things. It's those categories unified into a whole. And when you take all four of those together, four usually represents stability, so you have something very stable when you represent that. As far as, can you see five things in it? I don't know. I'm sure somebody could and draw meaning out of it, but I'm not prepared to do so today. So anyway, keep the thought of this, how this symbol represents these things over time. Another thing that you can leave here today and that I've drawn a lot of meaning from observing it that helps you understand these categories is folk dance. And I forgot to mention this the other day when we were talking about the feminine. We have the whole episode about tools to understand the feminine. And so folk dance is wonderful in this regard because folk dance nearly always has, women acting out a feminine role, you could say, and males and men acting out a masculine role, and you can see how they interact, right? You can see their very nature in the way the dance proceeds. And that's the incredible thing about music and motion, is that somehow music and motion can actually embody these patterns, right? It can contain these patterns in such obvious ways, right? The way that the women are almost always adorned in these complex colors and patterns and things like that, and the men have some of that, but it's less so, right? And they act much more as pillars out there, while the women are generally spinning and much more in a different type of fluid motion, while the men's motion is such different. So go and check out folk dance. There's endless amounts of it on YouTube, and you will, after this presentation, understand these categories better. And then lastly, before we jump in, I've listed I put the link to a favorite James Brown song that I think really gets into, it's really quite a profound song, and it's called It's a Man's World. And this particular version has him singing that with kind of some flourishes from Luciano Pavarotti, right? And so it's so wonderful because there's these two, kind of hyper-masculine guys, but then you listen to the lyrics and you listen to the music, and it so much brings in this feminine. So I've linked it below. You can watch it after, and after our discussion, I think you'll be even more prepared to kind of see the profundity of the masculine-feminine pairing. and why they would say, this is a man's world, but the other lyric is, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl. And with that, let's dive in. And I wish I had more visuals today. There could be so many visuals with that, but like I said, this is a rough draft. I'm always straining to just get the ideas together. So this is the version with less actual visuals, which you're just going to have to imagine. So the first most fundamental pairing that I think, especially in our society, should be the fundamental leading pairing when talking about masculine and feminine symbolism is heaven and earth. And another thing I should have said in the intro is that a lot of the ideas I've gotten today, or at least the most rich resource for the ideas that I've gotten today, because I've gotten them from a number of different sources, is this book right here, The Language of Creation, Cosmic Symbolism in Genesis. And it leads out with this symbolic pairing of heaven and earth and explaining it. But if you'll think about it, it's also what the Bible leads out with in the very first verse, right there at the beginning of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And there's no mistake that it leads out with that. It's laying out these two fundamental categories. A lot of traditions have something before the laying out of these two categories, and it's kind of a category of everything without division, right? The symbol that gets used for that a lot is the Uroboros symbol, which is actually on this. To give you an image of it, it's that snake that eats itself, okay? And it's always in a circle. Once you look for this symbol, you'll find it is still everywhere in society. It's in the ancient world. It's in the modern world too. It's this Uroboros symbol. And it later gets tied into the feminine for reasons that we'll see. But it's oftentimes used as kind of a pre-masculine feminine symbol to represent kind of the totality of everything. And the way that I would understand it is to imagine what the world is like for an infant. Right, for an infant human. Okay, it's such a useful exercise. If you have a young child, like as they're growing up, try to imagine what the world is for them, because I think it so much would help us. It helps you to understand the nature of consciousness. But try to understand what a little baby infant, how they see the world. Because when we look out of the world, we see things, we see words, we can point to all these different things, and all these. We see a cup, and a floor, and a ceiling, and a tool, and we see these colors. Well, guess what? To an infant, they start out, and they don't have those categories. They don't have those words, right? And so they have, at some point in there, whether it's in the womb or something, and their consciousness starts to develop. At the beginning, they must see everything without categories, right? But then, what is probably the very first categories that develop within an infant, probably in the womb, and that would be this fundamental dichotomy of heaven and earth. And very soon we're going to see it's tied with light and darkness, right? But they would most likely see this beginning division. Okay, so let's look at the nature of heaven and earth, because if all this just on the surface is not making sense in any way or doesn't seem natural in any way, my advice to you is stick with it, because it's just of that nature that if you're exposed to these categories for the first time, they don't initially make sense. Even as I'm going to try to explain them and make them easy to understand, there still may be a feeling of discomfort, and don't worry, that's normal as you try to understand them. But over time, as you do begin to kind of understand why they're framed in the ways they are, trust me, it will make more sense over time. But you may not even be able to explain it well. This video is very much kind of pressing me to my limits of explanation. So if you find that a lot of my explanations aren't that powerful, well, that's why I'm doing this, is because it forces me to try. And in trying, I see what lands and tries to get better. So we've got heaven and earth. Think about these categories and what their nature is. And the best way to do it is to not think of heaven in the way that some religions or kind of popular culture has taught us to think of heaven as like maybe this different place, this different dimension somewhere else. But think of heaven and earth just as if you walked out onto a landscape. I'm here in this beautiful landscape, and if I walked out of this shop right now and I looked out, I want you to think of heaven and earth in that way. What would you see? Right? Earth is this thing right around you. It's the dirt around you. It's the trees and nature and all these concrete things right around you. What is heaven? Heaven is the stuff up above. It's the sky, right? It's the sky and the air and the clouds and the birds are up there, okay? And that right there, those kind of experiences of heaven and earth are what you can kind of look through to understand these symbolic categories. And notice that throughout symbolism, there's almost always, again, a masculinity associated with heaven, a heavenly father up there, right? And then think about how earth, almost ubiquitously, is always associated with the feminine as a mother earth or a mother nature. I've never heard of the earth being referred to as masculine. I'm sure, you can always find an exception, but almost ubiquitously, the earth is feminine and a mother, and the sky or the heavens contain, the masculine or a father. Okay, so why is it that way? Well, a way of thinking about it is in terms of meaning there with heaven and matter down below. If you think about how we see anything in the world or understand anything in the world, right? Let's imagine an object like a glass or just a cup. Cup so often gets used in philosophical examples, but so I'll just use it again because I don't have a better example. But you think of a cup right there, right? There's kind of two major categories going on with that cup. There's the material, the matter that makes up the cup, right? But then there is the concept of a cup. There's the idea of a cup, or you could say the pattern of a cup, right? And the pattern of a cup is something that can apply to many different cups across that you find in the world, right? John Vervaeke, another thinker that's really helpful in kind of getting into this kind of thought, talks about a structural functional organization. If you think, what is it that actually makes up a cup, given that there's so many different kinds of cups, colors, styles, some with handles, some with not, what is it that kind of is the pattern of a cup? Well, it's something to do with its structure, right? And it's something to do with its function. It's something that can contain water, that you can grasp with your hand usually, right? So the structural functional pattern of the cup, that's heaven right there. That's this category of heaven. And then you've got the actual material that makes up the cup, whether it's metal or glass or things that have been formed into a cup, and that's the matter. Okay? And so you can see that if you bring those two things together, you bring together the pattern, the heavenly part, the meaning part, and you bring together the matter part, well, that is what then you have as a cup. Okay? And if you didn't have both those things, it would be nothing. Without that pattern, the cup wouldn't be a cup, right? There wouldn't even be a word for it. It'd just be part of everything else, okay? It'd be part of the rest of the earth if you didn't have the meaning, right? But if all you had was meaning, if all you had was that pattern, that idea of a cup, but no concrete example of it out here in the earth, then you also wouldn't be able to understand a cup because, the idea would be too abstract, you could say. You need examples of a cup in order to show you what a cup is. And so you need this union of heaven and earth to have anything. And so the reason you lead with this as symbolic categories is because if you can grasp this, and again, it's difficult stuff, it's philosophical stuff, but if you can grasp this basic thing about the way that everything has that kind of pattern to it, a structural, functional organization, and the way that it has matter that makes it up, then you'll see that that's how the world is formed all around us. Okay? Everything that we see, that we pick out in the world, has both this meaning part to it and this matter part to it. And when they come together, where do they come together? Up here in our consciousness, right? In the way that we experience the world, then that's the creation of something. And that's where you get these notions that we are in part, because of this ability to do this, we in part create the world around us, okay? And it's when you start seeing this and you start seeing different people that have talked about this in different ways, you see like this lies at the foundation of creation narrative. So like going a little bit further in the Bible, notice what the Bible does. It starts giving you example after example of kind of heaven and earth as different categories, such as a lesser light and a greater light, or light and dark, or a dry land and wet land, and then it kind of unifies them into a further category. So that's always the thing. If you bring together masculine and feminine pairings, there's always a way to kind of create a new thing out of it, right? And that's where we get the cup. If you bring together the idea of a cup, the heavenly part of it, and you bring together the matter part of it, the earthly part of it, then you get a new thing. You get a cup right here. It's the union of it. Okay, so if you can get that, then I'm going to list a number of other like masculine, feminine, symbolic pairings. So spirit and body would be the next one. Okay, and we see that again in the Bible. When man is formed, how is he formed? He has the breath of life, and breath or wind is just another word in the way the words are used in the Hebrew and later in the Greek. They're the same word as is used for spirit. Okay, so when you see spirit, think wind, think breath, think air, right? Think heaven. So man is made from the breath of life, right? And then the dust of the earth, okay? And so we are just another example of how everything's created. We have both a spirit side of us, this heavenly side of us, and then we have this earthly matter side of us. So another way of seeing it as seed and earth. So you have like a seed, which would be the heavenly part, right, the masculine part. And what does the seed contain? It contains just in this tiny little package, it contains all this potentiality within it, this little package of information, this pattern inside there that could then be applied out into numerous things. But what do you need? If a seed by itself is nothing, right? And that's where you get the masculine by itself, it's nothing. You need the ground. And once in the ground, then the information, the pattern of that seed can then be replicated, right? And so it takes the seed and the ground to form the plant or the tree. And then that pattern perpetuates over time, okay? So you can see this in temples, for example. The temple then, and this makes sense as we were talking about this pairing, or the Mont Saint-Michel, okay? If the Spirit of God is the heavenly part, then the temple is the earthly part, okay? So you've got the Spirit of God that's more of this unseen pattern, right? And then you've got the temple that's made of stones and bricks and things like that. But what has to happen for a temple to be a temple is that the temple has to be able to contain the pattern of heaven, of God, you could say, right? And so the temple itself, you can't make a temple, like I've never seen a temple that's just like a pit in the ground. That pit in the ground doesn't embody the pattern of heaven, right? If you look at temples, the earth, the stone material of the temple always has to be formed into something that can contain the pattern of heaven. So pretty much every temple across the whole world, right, is put into the shape of a mountain, and it's put into the shape of concentric spaces. When you look at it from above, you'll see either circles or squares within circles and squares leading to a point, which is usually the most holy place. And it's that kind of pattern, a mountain and concentric spaces, that can contain the pattern of heaven within it. And so then when people go to it, because they can both, when people go to it, they are then at this union of earth, the feminine, and heaven, the masculine, right? Such that something can be comprehended, right? You comprehend the nature of God. You feel in the presence of God in a temple because the pattern of God has been unified with an earthly manifestation of it, you could say, if that makes any sense. And I hope it does. Again, if it doesn't, stick with it because this is important stuff. Trust me on that. Okay, so going along in this line of kind of heaven and earth imagery, there's also a mountain and a cavern. Okay, so here you can see like a mountain is, well, actually I'm going to wait on the mountain and the cavern because it doesn't quite fit into this heaven and earth kind of one. But how about, here's a good one that explains this kind of grouping of masculine and feminine symbolism. How about the meaning of a word and the marks on a page? Okay, so here's one more way to really explain and hit home this thing. When you have a word, like let's say take the word cat, right? There is in the English language, in order to form the word cat, there are these marks on the page, brought together, the ink on the page in these symbols right there, but that is just kind of a container. That's just earth right there. If you just had those marks, but no concept or pattern of a cat, then those would just be marks on a page. They wouldn't be anything. We wouldn't notice them. We wouldn't pay attention to them. They'd be scribbles, right? So it takes a unifying of those marks of that earth with the structural, functional organization of a cat in order for there to then be a word, right? And it's the union of that word, so that the union is both the union with the markings on the page, also with this sound that comes out of my mouth when I say cat. It's a union of that earth, that's kind of earth right there, those sounds vibrating in my mouth, with this concept or pattern, this structural functional organization of a cat. Okay? So that notion right there, that heaven and earth connection, you will see throughout masculine and feminine symbolism. And what I hope you can see, again, is that when those two things are brought together, heaven and earth, then you have the world around you. Okay? That's kind of the important thing of that grouping. All right, I'm going to take a break here to kind of let you have a breather. I'm going to look at some of the things that you've been writing on the chat, see if there's something I can address now, or maybe we'll leave some thoughts for the end. Okay, so Martin says, define masculinity and femininity is an intrinsic property. I would say it has to be, yet Carl Jung created this philosophy that everyone has masculine and feminine energy. And he says it's not true. Okay, so there's some interesting things there, or important things as far as defining masculinity and femininity. And it's very difficult to define them. Like, I almost don't know how to do it without this kind of symbolism. I'll have to think if I have come across a good articulated kind of in just words definition of masculinity and femininity. I don't know. I am definitely not ready yet, but I'll think about that as we go, and it's definitely something to think about over time. So good things to throw in there, Martin. Christian Nemo comments on folk dance. And he lists some, I'm not sure what that word is that you put there, the salid. Maybe you can say a bit more of that because I'd be interested in what it is. He says dancing in a salid is so much better than a normal dance floor. So maybe you can say more about that because I'd like to look into it. And Christian Nemo also brings up Plato in this. Plato would say there's an ideal form of a cup. That's how we know it's a cup. Sounds like the heaven part of the cup. And so yes, these are definitely, this is kind of a Platonic way of looking at the world. Like, I'm not trying to just explain Plato because, of course, he has his own way of explaining this world of the forms that exists out there. And so, but it is in the vein of kind of a Platonic way of looking at the world. And Christian says, this feels like we are studying some kind of magic here over something academic. No, it's a good point that. And it should feel like that, actually, because if you look out there and you see that there is a magical element to it. That's why these categories, the way that I think you first see them if you go out and look into humanity, is the first place you'll see them is within the most basic imagery, the most primitive kind of imagery. But you'll start seeing it in dance, and you'll start seeing it in stories and things like that. And like I've said before, I really think it's at that level of our experience of the world that we start understanding things in religion and narrative and ritual. That's how we start playing with ideas. It's because we experience these things out in the world and we live them out in ways, and then we start putting them in something like you kind of put them in a package, like a ritual or a drama and a narrative, and that helps us understand them a bit more. And then later, the academics, start grabbing those and start trying to articulate them in more precise, technical speech. And that's when it often gets boring, there in like a philosophy class. It's not that it's not important, it's just that that's usually the general pattern of things. And by that point, hopefully new religious ideas and ritual and stuff is developing that to kind of introduce new ideas into humanity. Noah says, the mountain symbolism always seems to mean an old man, also like someone with lots of wisdom. Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. In so many cultures, there's the old man of the mountain. I've seen that definitely in the UK. I've seen that here in the United States. There's places that have been called, even a mountain structure will be called the old man of the mountain and whatnot. And it's something I've seen in Spain as well. It's a very common, mountains very often get tied in with masculinity and with an old man. Yep, that is a very good observation. Again, Christian brings up about that dance he's talking about. It's a Scottish traditional dance, kind of UK equivalent of a BAM dance. So yeah, I'm gonna go check that out. I'm always looking for new cool folk dance to study. And really, I should say, not just a study. I mean, that's what the world needs more of. We need to be doing folk dance, right? That's how people used to come together. You'd come together and you'd do things like dance together, and you see what you're doing there. You're embodying a pattern of meaning. You're living out masculinity and femininity. You're stepping into a role and combining into something beautiful. There's something so powerful to doing that, right? And we've lost that in our communities. We don't come together to do folk dance anymore. And I envy that and want it to come back. It's part of, like, here at Mission Top, something that is one of our dreams is to kind of bring the youth of this area together. And luckily here in the West, there's remnants of folk dance that we can get into. Okay, so let's jump into kind of the next category of masculine and feminine symbolism, or the next grouping, because I've kind of found that as I've looked at all these different pairings that I've seen, they kind of group together into similar pairings. So next I'll introduce the head and the body, right? So the head tends to be associated with masculinity and the body with femininity. And here's where, like, the value judgments, again, we need to, like, check the value judgments at the door, because today, to even say that the man is a head of a family, right, is something that would instantly be seen as sexist. But if you can drop that value judgment and see why the masculine is associated with the head and why the feminine with the body, and then see how there's a reason why the man was oftentimes given that role. It's a role to play, right? To be the head of a family, and the woman the body. Then these things start to make sense, and they don't need to be laden with our value judgments like we have now. So yeah, masculinity, the head, because when you start thinking of kind of the way that your head works and the way that the mind is associated with the head, then you'll see that the head is more filled kind of with that heavenly part, those concepts, right? Whereas the body is more that earth, the tangible matter part of ourselves. So you already see the heaven and the earth in that. But here's where you can actually see the power of the feminine in this, okay? Because when you start to understand the world this way, in this heaven and earth way, you come to see that our body, the way that we're embodied, frames the way that we look at everything out there. So, for example, when you look at a glass out there, or a cup, the cup that we were talking about. The reason it manifests itself as a cup is because, of its function, right? It's graspable, and it can be contained, filled with things, and it's useful, right? It has a structure such that it can serve a function. But what's the function, right? It's for our hand to grasp it. So we see a cup and have this category of a cup in the way it is because our hands can grasp cups. And then what can we do with that cup? It holds things like liquid such that it can fit in this hole here in the front of my mouth and put liquid into my body, okay? So to a fly, for instance, when he flies by this cup that's by me, the cup is not framed as a cup at all. Maybe it's an obstacle, maybe it's a thing of danger because the fly knows not to go fly into the liquid inside there because the surface tension of the water might trap the fly. And so the fly perceives that thing completely different because of the way the fly is embodied in the world. And so our body, this feminine part of us, you could say, frames the world for us. We see things the way they are because of how we are, because of the nature of how we are embodied. And John Vervaeke has some good points that I can't really articulate. You'll have to go search it out in his series called The Meaning Crisis, or Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where he makes an argument where they found that they can't even make an intelligence, or they've been unsuccessful thus far, like an artificial intelligence that isn't embodied. Like it doesn't work. And one of the reasons is that I think, if I'm remembering right, that's the case, is because a body limits you down to what's relevant in the world. And if you didn't have a body, let's say you just had the heaven, you just had the intelligence, the head, you could say, and not the body, well then how could you ever limit down what's important in the world, what's relevant, right? If you're just this unembodied intelligence, right? It's our body then that helps us to narrow down the world. And so that's, let's back up a little bit because this is also kind of philosophically important. Let's go back to our infant baby that is in the womb and doesn't have any categories or anything and just experiences everything at once as a whole. Like, how do you start to limit down everything, the expanse of reality? If to consider reality as a totality. How do you start to limit it down? I mean, you can't if you don't have something to limit it down. And so it's our bodies that do that. So this gives you this insight into the feminine that applies across the board. The feminine, then, and this can help you understand women, can help you understand so many things. The feminine is what kind of frames what the masculine can pay attention to. So instead of the head and the body, think of it as this, like the masculine's the head, but the feminine's the neck, right? So it's the neck, the masculine is this ability to pay attention to things, but it's the neck that actually, that's the head, but it's the neck that actually decides what the head is going to look at. Is it going to focus on this? Is it going to look over in this direction? So in that is the first beginnings of how you can see the power of the feminine, the unseen power of the feminine. There's these battles today about the masculine and feminine that women have been oppressed and this and that. But if you could realize that in a subtle, unseen way, it's the feminine that oftentimes determines what the masculine pays attention to, then you'll start to see that the feminine is just as powerful, just as influential as the masculine, even though, for reasons we'll get into in these other categories, the masculine gets all the attention, okay? All right, another category is ego and Uroboros, okay? And what I mean by that is the ego, kind of this sense of individuality in your sense as a personhood is tied into the masculine. The Uroboros, and that's where I'm bringing that category, that snake that eats itself, that's more of a totality of everything, is associated with the feminine. So, like Jung uses this one a lot, and Jungian thought, that as like this little infant, this proto-consciousness develops into a person, then it's the masculine part of them that's developing into like that individual person. Whereas the feminine, the Uroboros, is that tendency to see yourself not as an individual, but as a part of some greater whole, right? As a part of a greater reality. And hopefully you can see, these are both important concepts. It's important to be able to see yourself as an individual, as a separate thing, as aside from everybody else, and your individual character and identity, because masculine is always tied in with identity. But it's also important to be able to see how you're part of greater things, right? You're part of a family, you're part of a community. You are part of this earth. Like, if the earth is in a sense a living, breathing creature in many ways, and even a lot of scientists see it in that way, then you are part of that living, breathing creature of the earth. But then you can expand out from there, and eventually you reach this totality, the Uroboros. So that's ego versus Uroboros, masculine and feminine. Okay, another one that should be very helpful and interesting is right hand and left hand. Okay, so right hand is often tied into masculinity, and left hand femininity, and so this maps onto conservative and liberal. Okay, so if you start seeing that masculinity so often is tied in again with identity, with kind of distinguishing something as separate from everything else, and you see that femininity is more tied into a totality, to including everything, you start to see how this maps very well onto political identities. You know, the right is trying to form a perfect identity, and in that identity, it must exclude everything else that doesn't fit in to that identity, right? And the quintessential example today is the Nazi regime that defines its pure identity, and everything that doesn't fit into that identity is essentially, we should just eliminate it, right? It should be, and I'm already using purity language there too, where you see purity associated with masculinity, impurity associated with femininity, okay? So then you see the exact opposite of that would be communism, okay? Which is a notion of including everything and equalizing out the identity, okay? And so that's like the quintessential, the left hand taken to the extreme is something that tries to flatten out and equalize everything. So that also means that hierarchy is tied in with masculinity, equality tied in with femininity. And as we look out in the world, of course, these are the battles that we see, these battles between identities. You know, it's like in Europe, for example, with the whole immigration crisis that happens. You see that these are the battles. Are we trying to maintain our identities as a people and exclude? In order to do that, we have to exclude enough people, else they come in and we lose this identity that we have. And then other people say, no, we should include and welcome and bring in whatever we can into and take care of everybody and include everybody. But you see, there's this trade-off between identity and completeness that always is the tension that comes into conflict. So what's the answer? Well, maybe the answer, which I always get back to, is maybe things do need to maintain an identity to be anything, right? But at the same time, the world is constantly changing, so it's okay for in moderate ways for the identity always to be changing. So you should always be including things from the outside into your identity. Like as a person, if you just try to, say, this is my identity and I've got it fixed, well then of course you can't grow from there. It's impossible in a physical sense, in an emotional sense, in a moral sense, whatever. You're fixed. There's nothing to grow into. In order to grow, you do have to bring in things from the outside, things from outside that identity, and include them into that identity in order to grow and develop into something else. So once again, the way that these things, at their extremes, lead to breakdown, lead to death, lead to nothingness. And that's found in this symbol that I'm keeping up here this whole time, because if you follow that middle line in the middle as it kind of ebbs and flows between more masculinity and more femininity, if you go to an extreme on either end, you reach nothingness. And that's kind of the point, right? And it does reach a little point of nothingness on there. Okay, moving on. Another kind of grouping is the order and potential grouping. So this is the one that like a lot of people get mad at Jordan Peterson for, and I think he could have just corrected it so easily, and so often he didn't. It's kind of funny that he didn't, but he would say order and chaos. Masculinity is order, femininity is chaos. And because we have value judgments related to chaos, we say, oh, he's trying to say the feminine is bad, therefore women are bad, and they're just chaotic, beings. And no, that's not what he was trying to say. And it just needs a little correction to say, order is generally tied in with the masculine, but instead of chaos, which has that value-laden word, instead let's use potential. It's possibility. The feminine is the space of possibility, okay? And that maps very well onto the known, which would be the masculine, the unknown, which would be the feminine. So that, and then we bring in, okay, so that would mean like the city, the walled city, is the masculine, with kind of the center part of the city, where like in a medieval city, you'd have the core things that would define an identity. You'd have the church, you'd have the government, you'd have the public space where the festivals and things would take place. And then you'd have that all contained within walls. You'd have the body of the people in there. But then outside of those walls and away from that center, then you have the wilderness. Okay, so masculinity then is tied in with culture, and that's where we get the whole notion of the patriarchy is tied in, because culture and society by its very nature is more masculine. It's a holding together of an identity, and it can go bad. It can be the tyrannical patriarchy, right? But it can also be the thing that holds together any sense of order in our lives. So there can be a good there of course are plenty of good aspects to culture, but yes, it can go tyrannical and be bad as well. So that just shows you, again, masculinity can be good, can be bad, and it's the same thing with the wilderness or nature. We all need to go out there into nature, into the wilderness, into that feminine space. Why? To be refreshed and renewed and exposed to things not in an ordered sphere, and it's beautiful out there, right? Their beauty is very much more tied into femininity. But of course, out there in nature, it can very quickly turn into the most destructive and dangerous space out there. There's all sorts of monsters and beasts that can eat you. And so there's femininity. It can have this beautiful aspect. It can nurture. There's new life in nature. There's abundance. There's resources and all these new possibilities. But out there in nature, there's also bears that come onto my property, and grizzly bears. And so I'm kind of in this space where we have, it's kind of funny. Yeah, again, this is how you start seeing these categories everywhere. Right here in Mission Top, you have kind of our little more structured masculine zone around our house and our shop. I'm in the shop. And then out from that gets kind of more heavier layers of nature. And just out there a bit is a ravine, which is the bear pathway, I guess you could say, where on a regular basis, brown bears, grizzly bears, and black bears will come through, and yeah, they could eat my children very easily. None have done so in this valley forever, but they very much have the capacity to do so, and I have to live with this balance of culture and nature right next to each other. All right, I'm going to look back at the comments and see what you guys have been saying. Martin said earlier, I really like the fruit tree symbol. And yeah, the fruit tree, it's kind of cool because once you start to see the nature of masculine and feminine symbolism, you can see that the tree could both be associated with masculinity, like we've been doing in our Understanding Manhood series, or femininity, or both. Like if you start understanding the symbolism, you could see that the trunk of the tree would be the masculine part of it, and the branches off and the fruit coming from it would be the more feminine aspect. And And so there's that. There's also the way that, when you look at a tree, there's also two things you should, there's the seen part of the tree, and we're just about to get into this, the part that's above ground, and the part that we notice, and that's the more masculine part, but there's a whole other, half of the tree that's there hidden down in the earth, right? Which one's more important? Of course, they're both vitally important to the tree. That underground part, the hidden part, is the feminine, above ground would be the masculine. So this is how symbolism works, right? Symbolism, I've said this many times before, but it's very worth repeating because it's a difficult concept. Symbolism works by taking things that we are familiar with in the world, and then you look through them to understand things for which there aren't usually better language, or we look through them through the attributes of the things that we're familiar with in order to understand things that we're less familiar with, or that we want to explain very quickly to others. So an example that John Vervaeke gives is when you say, John is a pig, you're looking through the symbol of a pig and its different attributes in order to understand something about John. Okay, so John is a symbol, the pig is a symbol of John. And so that's what we can do with the tree. But because the tree has so many attributes, it can be used in different ways. It can be a masculine symbol, it can be a feminine symbol, it can be a symbol of the union of the two. And if that sounds complex, yes, it is. And welcome to the nature of this kind of symbolism. Okay, the next grouping would be light and dark. And this, again, you have right there in Genesis within the first few chapters, or first few verses. Light being associated with masculinity, darkness with femininity. And so, again, look through these symbols and feel out your experience with light. In the light, you can see particular things, right? The minute you turn on a light, if you're in a pitch dark room and the minute you turn on the light, everything forms into things already in your consciousness, just immediately. You start seeing things for their structural, functional attributes and how they're useful to you. And you can't even help it. You just do it automatically. Whereas in the dark, then everything around you there's a greater space of possibility in there, right? So there's many symbols off of this. Daytime, masculine; nighttime, feminine. Sun, masculine; moon, feminine. Wakefulness, masculine, right? Consciousness, masculine. Sleep, feminine. Unconsciousness, feminine. Feminine. The seen, then, is masculine. The unseen is feminine. And this is one of those potent images for masculine and feminine, because if you can start to understand that in your experience of the world, there's things that we see and we can articulate. And another distinction is public and private. We can look out and we see things in the media, we see things in movies, we see things around us, we see people out in the public square, and that's the whole masculine part of the world. But then there's this whole feminine part of the world. It's the unseen part of the world. What's going on actually within the confines of the home? When you have friends, maybe they're married, right? And you experience them and you get to see the part of the relationship that's seen. But what's going on in their home when you're not there? How is their relationship really going? You can't enter into that private space. There's the seen part of a person. You can see their face, you can hear their words, you can experience all that part of them. But what about the feminine part of them? What's going on inside of their consciousness? You can't access that. It's unseen, right? So the seen part is always associated with the masculine, the unseen part, the feminine. And that's where, again, you see which one's more important. Which one really determines the direction of the world? What we see in the media? Is it those events? Or is it what's going on in the private spaces of the homes and the places where the media can't access, right? And I would say, if anything, it's those private spaces, which is why we denigrate those private spaces, as Jordan Peterson would say, to our peril. You denigrate the private sphere where women have oftentimes had their most effective place and spent the most of their time. And lo and behold, you stop having as much of that feminine influence in the world, which I think is more powerful. Okay, good example of this that I brought up the other day in The Power of the Feminine is that you look at some of these titanic events in the world, the fall of Adam, the conversion of Constantine, the Roman emperor, to Christianity, that then led to the entire Roman Empire being converted to Christianity. We went over the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, but Jonathan Pajot is really good at showing like the history of Christianity is replete with anytime a new country converts to Christianity, anytime an emperor converts to Christianity, it's almost always the same story, that it turns out there was a sister, there was a mother, there was somebody that converted first, and then you have to wonder, what went on in those private spaces, the unseen places, that then out comes the public thing, the emperor converting to Christianity, the seen part, that produces the thing we document in history and the power. But what really determined what happened there? Maybe it was this conversation that went on in the bedroom, the private sphere between a wife and a husband, or that kind of thing. And so if you can understand how that works, you start to see how, the unseen part of the world is so vital. And another, just brilliant way to see this, and listen to the language I'm using. We can't even not talk in symbols. I'm talking in symbols already. But the way to kind of see this point is to think of wakefulness throughout the day and then sleep. Which is more important? Well, what happens? In the day, what are we doing? We're trying to order as many things as we can. Our mind is trying to make sense of as many things as we can in our consciousness. And we're categorizing and we're building and we're trying to stay focused on tasks, right? All masculine things. But if we do that forever, we can't handle it. We start breaking down. And what do you need? You need sleep. And what happens there in sleep? Well, in sleep, even from a scientific aspect, there's a breakdown. Even in our dreams, there's these weird combinations of categories and things that don't make logical sense. But in that, there's new possibility, right? And so you need that shaking up, that breaking down within you in the unconscious or less conscious state of sleep, the feminine part of the day, you could say, to then, boom, come back into masculinity again and start ordering, but now there's new possibility. There's new neural pathways, if you want to put it in a scientific sense, that have been formed in the night that help you see, here's a new way to around this idea, around this problem that I've been facing. So once again, you see that union of masculinity and femininity, and how the feminine space, the unseen, unconscious feminine space, is just as important or more important than the seen masculine space. Okay, I'm taking a look here at the chat. Okay, Christian brings up an interesting thing. Since you guys have been staring at this Yin Yang symbol for so long, he's saying, I wonder if there was to be some way to animate it, to make it kind of even be a better symbol through movement, and that's good. That would be, maybe they need somebody like you to create it. And Martin Coogan said, beautifully said, women too contributed to my conversion. I know of many friends where it has been the same. Yeah, that's where, to the masculine, if you understand masculinity or if you experience it as a person that's trying to be, predominantly masculine as a man, the influence of the feminine on you. You know the motivational factor. You know how that, in an unseen way, moves the direction in which you focus on in your life, right? So we experience these things, these symbols, and that's the best way to understand them. Okay, a new category. We are about 3/4 of the way through the category. So that would be, the next one is articulation and mystery. Okay, so we've already been circling around this, but the masculine is the revealed, the feminine is the hidden. The masculine is the rational thought, the articulation, the articulation of things. The feminine would be that intuition. It'd be that more emotional sense, the part that doesn't make sense per se, but that we know to be right, the part that we can't explain to us. And another way of looking at it is that the masculine is the answer to the more feminine question. And this again shows that power of the feminine, where the feminine can oftentimes frame the world for us. It asks the question, and by asking a question, by putting a space of possibility there before you, then the masculine, what does the masculine always want to do? Like, even maybe some of you have experienced this. If you're a guy and a woman comes to you, and she comes to you with her problems, right? She kind of puts out there a space of possibility. What do we want to do for them? We want to answer it. We want to say, oh, here's what you should do. Here's the answer to your problem. And of course, a lot of women get annoyed. They're like, no, I just wanted to share my possibility, my problems. I didn't want you to tell me what to do or answer it, right? But again, there's masculine and feminine right there up against each other. But that's the feminine space, is the question space. Okay, moving along to a new category, we have this pure and impure language. So if you look at purity, you'll see that it's very much tied up with identity. To have something be pure means that it's trying to maintain some identity. So pure water means that it's just the water. There's not anything else in it. It's not, if it's impure, it just means that other things have gotten mixed in it. And if you can look at it that way, that can help you abandon our value judgments that we have with purity and impurity. Just as a little aside, I really think it's a mistake. Maybe it was helpful along the way, but I think it's a mistake the way that morality, especially within kind of Protestant traditions, has put sexual morality into language of purity language. And it does make sense if you understand it as a categorical thing, but instead we've laden value judgments into it, right? Where if you maintain yourself pure, then you're good. If you're impure, then again, we bring in disgust sensibilities. To be impure, we kind of have these innate things of impurity is that ew feeling, that disgust feeling. And so people who have perhaps made themselves impure in some way, which again is just a category designation, then start receiving people treating them with disgust. And is that productive, in a religious context, in a moral context? It's kind of productive. Nobody wants to feel that disgust, so it's an incentive not to do impure things. But in the end of the day, I think it's coming to its end and its usefulness, and showing that it's not a helpful way to see things. And so one way I would introduce this, and that's, or better language than purity and impure as relates to moral things, maybe I'll make a whole video about this. I'm always saying that, of course, and it's hard to actually do it, but is to associate, instead of purity, using purity language, but complexity language. And it actually fits within purity as a symbolic category. So to do something, to do a sin per se, just makes your life more complex. If you enter into sexual relationships, perhaps before you've properly structured that relationship within the confines of something like marriage, then you've just introduced a lot more complexity into your life. And complexity in what regard? And again, this would be kind of that feminine side of things is tied up with complexity. Well, complexity in obtaining your goals. If you enter into a sexual relationship before you've ordered your life to be able to contain it, then your life is going to get a lot more complex in obtaining your goals. And in that sense, it's a sin, right? A sin means a missing of the mark. And so, instead of being impure and a gross person for having committed a sexual sin, you've merely made it more difficult to hit the mark of what you were aiming for. And see, there's a lot less value judgment in that, and I think a lot better path forward. If you want to repent from that, if you want to attain your goals, then all you have to do is reorient yourself towards your goals, and you move along, and hey, things are good. There's none of this tarnished with impurity kind of language. So this is tangentially related to masculinity and femininity, but it's one of my little pet peeves, and I thought I'd just put it out there. Okay, so pure masculine, impure feminine. So that's purity, masculine, mixture, feminine. You can see, again, going back to political categories, this is very much the case where conservative categories are much more concerned with purity, and feminine categories, like the left hand, the left wing, wants more of a mixture, a completeness. That's what they're after. And then we have clean and unclean, which is just another way of stating pure and impure. And if you really look, even in the Bible, where you get a lot of this language, and it is oftentimes tied in kind of in a moral dimension, you'll see very many instances where it's not, right? Such as, there's these states of being clean, and these states of being unclean. And for example, when things are death, things associated with death or touching a dead person or something can often make you unclean. And that's for a reason, because death, as we'll get to, that's a feminine category. It's a state of dissolving, of dissolution. And so uncleanness is also a state, again, that feminine state of impurity in this sense that's not a moral sense. And so you have to kind of rid yourself of that to become clean again. The point being, again, that not all the uses of this clean and unclean language, even in the Bible, where a lot of people get it from, has these moral dimensions. And I think we should be willing to kind of drop the moral dimension and look at these more in a symbolic way, and they'd be more helpful. Fresh water and salt water is oftentimes used in these ways. Fresh water, masculine; salt water, feminine. All right, moving together to a new category. This is the one of cohesion and breakdown. So a bringing together, that's a masculine way of looking at things, or a masculine kind of energy. Fracturing, feminine. So building up is masculine, breaking things down, feminine. Integration, masculine; disintegration, feminine. Excluding would be a masculine activity, because again, you're bringing something together, and in that there's leftovers that you exclude. Inclusion, feminine. And life and death, that's where I think that's maybe the most useful kind of thing to bring together, this kind of grouping, is that you can see how life is to hold a system together. Any living thing is usually a combination of any number of things. Even a bacteria has its different parts, and as it comes together in a life, it's held together in this system that maintains itself. Whereas what happens to everything that dies and experiences death? It dissolves out into fractured parts. So the death of a human being, we have this togetherness in our body, in our spirit, and then death is this fracturing of that, and even our body turns into endless millions and billions of particles that are then spread out there. So you can see how that life is tied in with masculinity, death with femininity. That also goes to efficiency, tied in with masculinity; resiliency, femininity. And that may not make perfect sense on the beginning of things, but if you see, the masculine, when you're efficient, you are kind of grouping things and ordering things in a way to get exactly what you want, whereas resiliency is much more leaving a space of possibility, so that if things change, you have a lot more resources to help you. And that brings us to our last category in all this, and that would be the notion of space and time. Okay, so this is another way that you see these masculine and feminine categories expressed. So space is associated with masculinity, time with femininity. And the way to understand this is not to see time as we've come to see it as kind of the arrow of time going from an endless past in a direction into the future. So it's not directional time. Think of this as cyclical time. This is the way the ancients saw time, by the way. Most ancient societies is that they saw time in a cyclical way. And that's because every day a cycle recurs, right? With the sun going up and down day and night. But then there's other cycles. There's the lunar cycles that kind of give us that sense of month. There's the yearly cycles in which they could, and the cycles of the seasons. And so if you see time, time that kind of cycle, just the very nature of a cycle, is more in the space of a circle and a wheel, and it's ever moving and ever changing, right? Whereas space is associated not with space like out there, space, the final frontier in Star Trek, but space in terms of like a fixed place in space. And so the symbols associated with this are like a pillar for space that fixes something, in an axle for time, because an axle, it connotes turning and cycling of something. It's also a square, suggests space, a stability, a place, in space that doesn't move, whereas the circle is something that connotes a movement and a cycle, and also a completeness. Okay, and so this is where places like temples are so interesting, because when you start looking at the structure of temples across societies, whether they're in various Asian cultures, whether you're in somewhere else, you'll start seeing that very much both circles and squares are used, because ultimately the temple is usually a map of meaning. It's trying to show you these kind of fundamental categories in the world. Here's one that's associated with this. It will kind of illustrate the point, but it gets you out of kind of the circle square mentality, and that would be bread and wine. So you'll notice that these are the symbols used in communion, in the Eucharist, in the Christian tradition. Some call it sacrament. So you have the bread and the wine. Well, one is we experience bread as this stable, foundational kind of thing, right? And then what is wine? Wine is a thing of transition and change around that. So you can see why these would be the fundamental kind of ritualistic symbols of Christianity, because here they are giving us these kind of two natures of reality. And so in the end, when time dominates the feminine, you could say, there's not a clear connection between heaven and earth. Okay, those are the times where things don't make sense. Where there's no connection between the meaning and the world. So there are times of upheaval, when things are upside down. So right now would very much be a time of time, I guess you could say, in the world, where a lot of people are looking out in the world and just things are not making sense. The meaning that we want to see is not connecting to the things that we see around us. Things don't make sense, things seem upside down. And that contrasts a time when space dominates. Things make sense, they're ordered. There is a very clear connection between spiritual meanings up above and earthly matter down below. And I apologize, I'm out here and it's actually kind of chilly, and I start having my nose run, so that's why I'm doing that. I'm not getting emotional about this side. I'm not especially emotional about time and space. But this is a good place to end, because it just once again shows that both space and time in these kind of senses are necessary things, because there's a time where we want things to be ordered and structured, to hold together in the world and for things to make sense. But you can see that the natural course of any society is that you build up that structure, things go well for a while, but then what happens? Pride develops, right? You think that you've reached a state of completion, that you've figured it all out, that that's the time when the towers of Babel get built, right? And so you see there's that masculine mountain or temple being built, and you're saying, oh, we figured it out, we've got our path to heaven, and it's built up. And it's funny because there's even these cycles even occur in nature without anybody doing anything. So think of sand falling in an hourglass, and just naturally the sand is building up into a mountain. But what eventually happens? Like inevitably, it reaches this criticality period where it naturally falls apart, right? And that's what happens. That's what happens to societies. That's what happens in our own life. That's what happens if you try to stay up too long in the day, if you try to have too much masculinity, too much ordering, too much focus on too much consciousness, that eventually that will that ordered state will fall apart, and then the mountain crumbles, and the sand comes down to its base. But just like in the hourglass, the cool thing is that's actually necessary. That's a part of the way that the world is structured. The sand keeps on falling, and what happens the next time? It builds up a bigger mountain than it was before. So this is where we'll end, because we'll bring this back into the way that the union of the masculine and feminine, these categories, are at the heart of how the world progresses, you could say. Because you could see that with that mountain of sand, that there is this natural state of integration and then dissolution, but it can be in a direction of progress, you could say. Okay, and so this is where I think what we need to figure out about the world right now is how. Because, again, we're fighting between the extremes of these two things. We want this greater masculine kind of principle in the world. We want this greater feminine principle in the world. The solution is to bring them together in this process, which I will call a process of progress. So if you could see, like, a masculine way of looking at the world is this hierarchy, this mountain that just goes straight up, and it's like this ladder, but it ultimately can lead to pride, and it will break down anyway. And the feminine is like this cycle, this turning, this ever-changing, cyclical kind of thing that breaks things down. Well, then maybe what we need to be aiming for is something like a coil, a coil that keeps on circling and circling, but where is it going? It's going in a direction. Something very much like the structure of DNA looks, right? It's like a helix, a staircase that's a spiral staircase towards something better. And that, in kind of my vein of thinking, is how I think. It's that process of progress that I talked about at the beginning, like even here at Mission Top, that we're after. That we're trying to integrate this process in our lives of the union of the masculine and the feminine, where there's both an integration, a good balance between an integration and a breakdown. And we realize the value of both. That in the course of life, you need these operating in a combined, coherent process. And this is so profound because when everywhere you look at it, science, mythology, you'll find the same thing. So in neuroscience right now, this is the way that our brains work, right? Our neurons are doing this at, in light speed or whatever. Our neurons build up patterns. There's integrating part of how our neurons fire in the air, and they build structures, and there's other parts that dissolve them instantly, okay? And so there's this constant process of integration and dissolution that even forms our consciousness from a scientific aspect. So you can see how deep this goes, and why we see these masculine and feminine pairings all around us in the world, and why it's good to understand them, to start familiarizing yourself, seeing them, and then trying to incorporate them as principles into your own life. And why it's important to see, okay, if you're a man and you want to be playing more that masculine role, you think your body's more of a masculine body, your mindset leads to a more masculine framework on the world, you can see that still leaves you incomplete. You are not going to be able to enter into this pattern of progress where new and good things come out of you and you grow in your nature and your identity and things like that, unless you pair yourself with somebody that fills those gaps, that can offer the feminine to your masculine and the masculine to your feminine. All right? So that's where I'll end up on this, that this masculine and feminine pairing is inextricably tied up with progress, the kind of development and progress that I think lies at the heart of what most engages us as humans, what most gives us that sense of heaven to us, and that's how deep and profound it goes. So that's all I have to say about that today. This was a lot today, and you can see this strains me. I apologize for the parts where I wasn't as articulate, and this will help me get better over time. Okay, let's look at anything else that's been said here today. Yeah, Christian says, this is intense stuff. I'm really keen to have more symbolic fluency. And yes, that's what this is all about, is seeing, here's heaven and earth again. If you can understand these symbolic patterns, then you look out into the world, into the earth, and the way that things are playing out in the world, and you'll see the meeting of the pattern with some manifestation of the pattern out there in the world. And you'll have that aha experience, and you say, I get it why society is doing this right now. I get it why this group of women is feeling this way right now. Because, whatever the particular situation is, I get it why this country is reacting in this way right now, because everything manifests itself into these symbolic patterns. And when you understand them, that can give you a deeper understanding of the world, and you're not left so much in that state of chaos. But recognizing the feminine principle, then you've got to say, okay, I understand that much, but hey, let's see if I can break down my understanding now and open myself to new possibilities of understanding. And that's what I hope to do with these ideas, for instance, is the minute I start repeating myself too much and all my ideas that may seem fresh to you now start to become old, and if I'm doing too much old, please tell me, because that means I'm just stuck too much in ordering and I haven't begun to break down my own thought, introduce new ideas, incorporate new things. I was thinking about that a lot yesterday because Paul Vanderklay was talking. He has this really good analysis of Jordan Peterson. If you haven't gone to Paul Vanderklay's channel, I'd highly recommend it. He's a minister, a pastor, but he is probably the best commentator on kind of the development of Jordan Peterson that I've found. He does a really good job of kind of digging into the details and then producing an analysis. And yesterday's video, kind of saying, does Jordan Peterson have a plan, was really good because he brings out all the weaknesses of Jordan Peterson, right? And it has many, and kind of has a deep, he has a deep respect, but also is willing to have a deep criticism of kind of the Jordan Peterson line of thinking. And again, I think I probably mentioned Jordan Peterson's name too much because it actually doesn't, it's actually not like I don't spend tons of time actually thinking about him. It's just that I think he was the gateway, again, to a lot of this thinking that led me to other thinkers that then enriched the way that I saw the world. For example, with like Jonathan Pageau, who it's his brother that wrote this, Mathieu Pageau. And it's funny because Jonathan Pageau, he's the one that's kind of in the masculine principle of explaining all these things to the world. But you see that it's actually Mathieu that probably did, not all, but a significant part of actually coming up with the ideas, and then they talk about them, and then etc. So once again, another place of this playing out in the world. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions or things like that coming in today. Once again, I thought this was going to be a 20-minute video. I just kind of list out the categories, but you get into them, and I can't do that. Yeah, I can't make a 20-minute video with all these things, and there's too much to say. But probably if I did this video again, I could maybe get it to an hour instead of an hour and a half. So that's progress right there. Thank you for being here. We'll be back tomorrow, maybe with that next Understanding Manhood video, maybe with something else. I'll try to get the announcement out so that you can kind of anticipate what we're going to be talking about. Okay, see you later.